Michael Johnson had everything a man could dream of: wealth, success, and a beautiful family. By the age of 39, he had built a real estate empire, making him one of the most powerful and respected men in the city. But despite his financial achievements, life had once taught him a brutal lesson: money could never replace the people you love. 6 years ago, Michael's life took a devastating turn. He had been returning home from a late-night party with his wife, Andrea, and their 5-year-old son, Joseph, when exhaustion got the best of him. He fell asleep at the wheel. The crash was catastrophic. When Michael woke up 3 months later in a hospital bed, the world he once knew was gone. His wife and son hadn't survived the accident. The pain was unbearable. Guilt consumed him, whispering in his mind day and night, telling him it was his fault. If only he had been more responsible, if only he had let Andrea drive, if only he hadn't stayed out so late. But if only couldn't change the past. His home, once filled with laughter and warmth, became a cold, empty space, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Michael spiraled into darkness. He buried himself in work, hoping that the relentless pursuit of wealth would numb the pain. He closed himself off from friends, refused to talk about Andrea and Joseph, and avoided places that reminded him of them. The once ambitious, business-driven man became a hollow version of himself. For months, he struggled to find meaning in life. What was the point of all his success if the two people he loved most were gone? The cars, the luxury penthouse, the designer suits, none of it mattered anymore. He had built his empire for his family, but now that they were gone, his fortune felt meaningless. It was during one of his many sleepless nights that something shifted inside him. He realized that living in regret wouldn't bring Andrea and Joseph back. But perhaps, just maybe, he could honor their memory in a different way. Andrea had always believed in kindness. She had a heart for people in need and often encouraged Michael to use his wealth to help others. He used to brush off her suggestions, claiming he was too busy or that charity work was for people with nothing else to do. But now, her words echoed in his mind. Determined to change, Michael decided to dedicate his life to helping those less fortunate. He started funding orphanages, hospitals, and education programs. Instead of chasing profits, he poured his energy into philanthropy. Yet, even as he gave back to the world, the void in his heart remained. No amount of good deeds could erase the loneliness he felt. The ache of missing his wife and son never faded. Then, one December morning, everything changed. Christmas was always a difficult time for Michael. It was a season of joy and family gatherings, yet for him, it was a painful reminder of the people he had lost. Every December, he found himself retreating into his own thoughts, trying to escape the emptiness that the holiday season brought. That year, however, something felt different. Instead of drowning in his grief, Michael decided to throw himself deeper into his philanthropic work. He had already been supporting various charities and orphanages, but this time, he wanted to do something more personal. A week before Christmas, he received an invitation from Elizabeth, the director of an orphanage in a nearby city. She had heard of his generosity and asked if he would be interested in visiting the children and organizing a small Christmas celebration for them. Without hesitation, Michael agreed. When he arrived at the orphanage, he was greeted warmly by Elizabeth, a kind-hearted woman who had dedicated her life to caring for abandoned children. As she showed him around, she spoke about the struggles they faced: limited resources, not enough volunteers, and the difficulty of finding permanent homes for many of the kids. Michael listened intently, his heart aching for the children who had no family to celebrate with during the holidays. He decided then and there to make this Christmas unforgettable for them. With the help of his team, he organized a grand celebration. He hired a Santa Claus, arranged for a massive Christmas tree, and bought personalized gifts for every child. The once dreary orphanage was transformed into a festive wonderland, filled with twinkling lights, colorful decorations, and the warm aroma of hot cocoa and freshly baked cookies. On Christmas Eve, as the children unwrapped their presents with wide-eyed excitement, Michael walked around, soaking in the joy on their faces. But amid all the laughter and celebration, his eyes landed on a boy sitting quietly in the corner. The child had tousled brown hair and deep, thoughtful eyes. He wasn't rushing to open his gift like the others. Instead, he held the wrapped box in his hands, staring at it as if unsure whether he should open it at all. Something about the boy struck Michael. There was an inexplicable familiarity in the way he sat, in the way his eyes carried a quiet sadness, a loneliness that mirrored Michael's own. Michael approached gently, crouching beside him. "Hey there," he said with a warm smile. "Mind if I sit with you?" The boy didn't answer right away. He glanced up briefly, then nodded. Michael handed him the gift. "This is for you. I hope you like it." The boy hesitated for a moment before carefully unwrapping the package. Inside was a sleek, remote-controlled car. His fingers brushed over it slowly, as if he couldn't believe it was really his. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're welcome," Michael replied, watching him closely. "What's your name?" "Matthew," the boy answered softly. Michael felt an odd sensation in his chest. Something about this boy stirred emotions he couldn't quite explain. "You like cars, Matthew?" The boy nodded, his fingers gripping the toy. "I've never had one before." Michael smiled, though his heart ached at the thought. "Well, now you do." For a few moments, they sat in silence, watching the other children play. But as Matthew finally looked up at him, Michael's breath caught in his throat. The boy's face, it was as if he were staring at a younger version of himself. The resemblance was uncanny. The same face shape. The same expressive eyes. A strange chill ran down his spine. He tried to shake it off. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. But deep down, something told him this was more than that. This meeting, this boy, was about to change everything. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The resemblance between him and Matthew was too strong to ignore. The way the boy looked at him, the familiar sadness in his eyes, the shape of his face, it all felt too personal, too real. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, memories of his son, Joseph, flooded his mind. He could still remember the way Joseph would grip his hand when they walked together, the way his laughter used to fill their home. He had spent years mourning, trying to make peace with the fact that his son was gone. But now, for the first time, a tiny spark of doubt crept in. Could it be possible? Was there even a chance that Joseph had somehow survived? Michael needed answers. The next morning, he called his longtime lawyer and trusted friend, Richard Morales. "Richard, I need your help," Michael said, his voice tense. "There's a boy at the orphanage I've been supporting. His name is Matthew, and something about him feels familiar. Too familiar. I need to find out where he came from." Richard, always the calm and rational one, listened carefully. "We'll start with the orphanage records," he said. "I can reach out to my contacts and see what we can find. But if you're serious about this, I suggest hiring a private investigator. If there's more to this story, we need someone who knows how to dig deep." Michael didn't hesitate. "Do it. Find the best person for the job." By the end of the day, Richard had arranged a meeting with a well-respected investigator, Luis Vasquez. Luis was known for his ability to uncover hidden truths, no matter how deeply buried they were. He arrived at Michael's office that evening, a man in his early 50s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet confidence. "I understand you have an interesting case for me," Luis said, shaking Michael's hand firmly. Michael wasted no time. He explained everything: his past, the accident, the loss of his wife and son, and his strange connection to Matthew. He handed Luis a file with the information the orphanage had given him. Luis listened without interruption, flipping through the papers with careful attention. When Michael finished speaking, the investigator leaned back in his chair. "This is definitely worth looking into," Luis said. "The resemblance alone is enough to raise questions. But if Matthew has been in the orphanage for 6 years, we need to find out exactly how he got there." Luis began his investigation immediately. His first stop was the orphanage, where he met with Elizabeth. "Can you tell me everything you know about Matthew?" he asked. Elizabeth nodded. "He was left here as a baby, wrapped in a blanket with only a short note. The note claimed that his parents had died in an accident and that whoever left him here couldn't take care of him." Luis took a photo of the note and examined it closely. The handwriting was rushed, almost desperate. "Do you still have the original?" he asked. Elizabeth nodded and retrieved it from a locked file cabinet. Luis carefully placed it in a protective folder. It might be the key to uncovering the truth. His next stop was the hospital records office. He searched for any reports of an accident that matched the time frame of Matthew's arrival. After hours of combing through files, he found something that made his heart race. A report from 6 years ago detailed a car crash involving a couple named Andrea and Michael Johnson. The report confirmed that both adults had died at the scene. But there was another detail, a line buried in the hospital notes. "Infant male, approximately 1 year old, found at the crash site. Transported to hospital for evaluation." Luis's hands tightened around the paper. A baby was found at the scene. But if Michael's son had died, then who was this child? Luis knew he was onto something much bigger than he had expected. This wasn't just a coincidence. Something had happened 6 years ago, something that someone had tried to cover up. And Luis was going to find out the truth. Luis sat in his car outside the hospital, staring at the report in his hands. The evidence was overwhelming. A baby had survived the accident. But if Joseph had lived, why had Michael been told otherwise? Who had covered this up? And more importantly, why? There was only one way to get to the truth. The next morning, Luis tracked down Amelia, a former nurse who had worked at the hospital 6 years ago. She had left her job unexpectedly and had since moved to a small town outside the city. It had taken some digging, but Luis finally found her. When she opened the door, her face went pale. "You're here about the baby, aren't you?" she whispered. Luis nodded. "I need to know the truth, Amelia. What really happened that night?" Amelia hesitated but then stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. She poured herself a cup of tea, her hands shaking as she spoke. "The night of the accident," she began, "I was on duty. A baby was brought in, barely breathing but alive. The doctors did everything they could, and miraculously, he stabilized." Luis leaned forward, sensing the weight of what she was about to say. Then, something strange happened. A man came into the hospital. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't staff. He claimed to be from a government agency, said there were complications with the baby's case. Amelia's voice dropped to a whisper. "He told us the child had no surviving family and needed to be placed under state care immediately." Luis's jaw clenched. "And you believed him?" Amelia shook her head. eyes filled with regret. Something felt off, but he had official-looking documents, and the hospital administrators didn't question him. He took the baby that night. I never saw him again. Louise took a deep breath. Do you remember his name? She nodded. Alejandro Delgado. Louise felt a cold chill run down his spine. Alejandro Delgado was a name he knew all too well, a notorious businessman with deep ties to illegal activities, including human trafficking. Louise wasted no time. He went straight to Michael's office. Michael, he said urgently. I have answers. Michael, who had been anxiously waiting for news, sat up straight. Tell me everything. Louise recounted Amelia's story, watching as Michael's expression shifted from shock to rage. They told me my son was dead, Michael murmured, his fists clenched. But he wasn't. Someone took him. Someone let me believe I had lost him. Louise nodded. And I think I know who. Alejandro Delgado. He's been involved in child trafficking cases before. It's possible he planned to sell your son, but, for some reason, abandoned the plan and left him at the orphanage instead. Michael stood abruptly. I want him found. I want justice. Louise had already anticipated this. I've contacted my law enforcement connections. They've been after Alejandro for years. Now that we have new evidence, they're moving in. The next morning, the police raided Alejandro Delgado's mansion. They found stacks of forged documents, including adoption papers and hospital records. When Alejandro was finally handcuffed, he smirked. You think you've won? He sneered at the officers. I always find a way out. But this time, he wouldn't. Louise ensured that Amelia's testimony, along with the hospital records, was enough to lock Alejandro away for a long time. Meanwhile, Michael was left reeling. The truth had been revealed. Matthew was, in fact, his son, Joseph. As he stood outside the orphanage, ready to tell Matthew everything, his heart pounded. How do you tell a child he has a father he never knew existed? But as soon as Matthew saw Michael, he ran to him, smiling brightly. Michael knelt down and hugged him tightly. I have something to tell you, Matthew, he whispered. Something that will change everything. Michael had spent years believing his son was gone. Now, with the truth revealed, he was filled with both relief and rage. Someone had stolen his child, let him grieve for a loss that never happened. And that someone, Alejandro Delgado, was finally going to pay for his crimes. Luis worked closely with law enforcement to ensure that the case against Alejandro was airtight. They had testimony from Amelia, the former nurse who had witnessed the abduction. They had hospital records proving that Joseph had survived the accident. And they had evidence linking Alejandro to forged documents related to illegal adoptions. But Michael wanted more than just legal action. He wanted to understand why. Why had Alejandro taken Joseph in the first place? What was the motive behind it? The answer came during Alejandro's interrogation. At the police station, Alejandro sat in a cold, dimly lit room, his hands cuffed to the table. Across from him sat Detective Ramirez, a seasoned officer known for getting criminals to talk. You've got nothing on me, Alejandro sneered. A few old papers and the word of a washed-up nurse? Please. Ramirez smirked. Actually, we have quite a bit more than that. Witness testimony. Fraudulent adoption records. And let's not forget the hospital report that says a baby was taken from the scene of an accident where the parents just happened to be Michael Johnson and his wife. Alejandro's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. So what? That doesn't prove anything. Ramirez leaned forward. Then let's talk about motive. Why did you take the child?" For the first time, Alejandro hesitated. His fingers twitched against the table. "Fine," he finally muttered. The kid was supposed to be part of a private adoption. Rich families who couldn't have children, they were willing to pay anything for a healthy baby. Your beloved Joseph was meant to be sold to one of them. Michael, who had been watching through the two-way mirror, clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. The thought of his son being trafficked like a commodity made his blood boil. But something went wrong, Alejandro continued. The people who were supposed to take him backed out at the last minute. Too much media coverage on the accident, too much risk. I had no choice but to dump the kid at the orphanage and move on. Ramirez's jaw tightened. You let a grieving father believe his son was dead, all because a deal didn't go through? Alejandro shrugged. Business is business. Michael had heard enough. He stormed into the interrogation room, his face red with fury. You stole my son. He growled, slamming his fists on the table. Alejandro flinched but quickly masked his fear with arrogance. And yet, you're the one who left him to die in a crash. Before Michael could react, Ramirez stepped between them. Mr. Johnson, I understand your anger, but let the justice system handle this. Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He wouldn't let Alejandro provoke him. In the end, Alejandro was charged with multiple crimes: human trafficking, forgery, kidnapping, and fraud. The court wasted no time in sentencing him to life in prison without parole. With Alejandro locked away, Michael could finally breathe. The nightmare was over. Now, he could focus on what truly mattered: bringing Joseph home. Michael stood outside the orphanage, his heart pounding harder than it ever had before. He had faced ruthless businessmen, courtroom battles, and even the man who had stolen his son, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. How do you tell a child that everything he knows about himself is about to change? Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The children were playing in the courtyard, their laughter filling the air. But Michael's eyes searched for only one: Matthew. There he was, sitting on the steps, holding a small sketchbook in his lap. He looked up, saw Michael, and smiled. "Hi, Michael," Matthew said cheerfully, running up to him. "You're back." Michael knelt down to his level, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Hey, buddy. Can we talk for a minute?" Matthew nodded, curiosity flickering in his eyes. They walked over to a quiet bench under a large oak tree. Michael took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Matthew," he started gently, "I found out something really important about you." The boy tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Michael hesitated. "Remember the test we took a little while ago?" Matthew nodded. "Well, it told us something incredible." Michael's voice softened. "You're not just a special kid to me. You're my son, Joseph." Matthew blinked. His little hands gripped the edge of his sketchbook. I don't understand." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photo, the last one taken of him, Andrea, and Joseph before the accident. He handed it to Matthew. "That's you," Michael said, pointing to the toddler in the picture. "And that's your mom, Andrea." Matthew stared at the photo, his fingers tracing the faces. His eyes darted back to Michael, searching for answers. "I don't have a family," Matthew whispered. "You do," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "You always have. I lost you 6 years ago in an accident. I thought you were gone. But you weren't. You were brought here. And now, I found you." Tears welled up in Matthew's eyes. You mean, you're my real dad? Michael nodded, barely holding back his own tears. Yes, buddy. I'm your dad. And I love you more than anything in this world. For a moment, Matthew just sat there, processing everything. Then, suddenly, he threw his arms around Michael, hugging him tightly. I always felt like I knew you, Matthew whispered against his chest. Like you were meant to be in my life. Michael held his son close, his heart aching with both sorrow and overwhelming joy. And I was meant to find you. I promise, I'll never let you go again. That evening, Elizabeth gathered the children to say goodbye to Matthew. There were hugs, laughter, and even a few tears. Will you still visit us? One of the kids asked. Matthew nodded. Of course. My dad and I will come back and bring presents. Michael chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. You bet we will. As they drove home, Matthew sat in the front seat, looking out the window at the city lights. So, do I call you Michael or Dad? He asked shyly. Michael smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. You can call me whatever feels right to you. Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he whispered, Dad. Michael felt his chest tighten. He had waited 6 long years to hear that word again. When they arrived home, Michael carried Matthew inside and showed him his new bedroom, a space decorated with his favorite colors, filled with books, toys, and even a brand new soccer ball. Matthew's eyes widened. This is, for me? All yours, Michael said. This is your home now. Matthew turned, looked at Michael, then ran into his arms. I love you, Dad. Michael hugged him tightly, his eyes glistening. I love you too, Joseph. More than you'll ever know. And just like that, after years of pain and separation, Michael and his son were finally home.